When the last wagon rolled away from Millbrook Township carrying Florence Ida's three sisters toward marriages they'd never chosen, she stood alone in the doorway. The only daughter her father couldn't sell. The autumn of 1863 had turned the wheat fields into a sea of brittle gold. But Mabel and Rhodes felt nothing but cold as she watched her youngest daughter sweep the empty parlor. 3 chairs sat vacant where Florence Ida's sisters had taken their final breakfast that morning. 3 dowries paid. 3 mouths no longer to feed. "Papa's done what he had to do," Mabel whispered, though her voice cracked like winter ice. The war had taken their sons. First Samuel to Gettysburg, then young Thomas to some nameless field in Virginia. Now only Franklin Rhodes remained, his back bent from carrying a farm that once fed 8 and now struggled to sustain 3. Florence Ida paused her sweeping, dust motes dancing in the slanted light that filtered through windows she'd cleaned with her own tears. At 19, she possessed her mother's gentle eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, but something else entirely, a fierce loyalty that had kept her rooted when others might have fled. "The Barlow boy's been asking after you," Franklin said from the doorway, his weathered hands working the brim of his hat. "Nathaniel's got good land up north. Good prospects." She turned to face him, this man who'd traded away her sisters like cattle at market. "And what did you tell him, Papa?" "Told him you'd think on it." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Outside, the wind carried the scent of burning leaves and something else, the distant smoke of a world at war with itself. Florence Ida had heard the stories from town, how Nathaniel Barlow had lost his young wife to childbed fever just 2 years past, how he wandered his property like a ghost seeking absolution. "I won't be bartered away," she said, each word sharp as broken glass that Franklin's shoulders sagged. "Child, there ain't nothing left here for you. Your mother's failing and I—" He trailed off, but she could read the truth in his eyes. The consumption that had claimed his brother was already working its way through his lungs. That evening, as Mabel coughed herself to sleep, Florence Ida stood at her bedroom window watching the road. 3 times now, she'd seen the lone rider pass, always at dusk, always heading toward the Barlow spread. Nathaniel himself, she reckoned, though she'd never spoken to him directly. The next morning brought Hiram Greeley's wagon rattling up their drive, its wheels cutting deep ruts in the frost-hardened earth. The old merchant's face was grim as parchment. As he climbed down, his breath misting in the cold air. "Franklin," he called, not bothering with pleasantries. "Got word from Richmond. The Union's pushing south again." Florence Ida watched from the kitchen window as her father's face went white. They'd thought themselves safe this far north, but war had a way of spreading like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. "How long?" Franklin asked. "Week, maybe 2. Folks are leaving." The widow Bly's already packed her wagon. Florence Ida's hands stilled on the bread dough she'd been kneading. Winifred Bly had buried 2 husbands and sworn she'd never leave her land. Yet now even she was running. "What about the Barlow place?" Franklin asked. Hiram spat into the dirt. "Nathaniel's staying. Says he's got nothing left to lose." That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, Florence Ida found herself walking the path toward the Barlow farm. She told herself it was curiosity, nothing more, but her feet carried her steadily forward through the dying light. The house sat alone on a gentle rise, its windows dark except for one, a single candle flickering in what might have been a kitchen. As she watched, a figure moved past the window, tall and lean, carrying the weight of solitude in every step. She almost turned back then, but something made her continue up the path. Perhaps it was the way the house seemed to lean into the wind, as if it too were mourning. Or perhaps it was the sound that reached her ears, a low, mournful humming that spoke of loneliness so deep it had found its own voice. The front door opened before she could knock. Nathaniel Barlow stood framed in the doorway, his dark hair disheveled, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by honest labor. His eyes, blue as winter sky, held a startled recognition. "Miss Florence," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "I wasn't expecting—" "I know," she said simply. "May I come in?" He stepped aside, and she entered a house that felt more like a tomb than a home. The furniture was clean but untouched, as if he'd been living around its edges rather than within its embrace. On the mantel sat a daguerreotype of a young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, his departed wife, she realized. I heard you were staying, she said, settling into a chair that probably hadn't held a woman's form in 2 years. Where else would I go? He remained standing, his hands working nervously at his sides. This is all I have left of her. Florence Ida looked around the room, seeing not just the physical space, but the emotional landscape it represented. Here was a man trapped by his own devotion, unable to move forward because movement felt like betrayal. My father thinks you might offer for me, she said quietly. Nathaniel's face colored. That is, I hoped, but I wouldn't presume to. The war's coming north, she interrupted. Papa's sick and Mama's fading. If something happens to them, she didn't need to finish. They both understood the arithmetic of survival in a world where unprotected women faced fates worse than death. I won't lie to you, Nathaniel said finally. I can't promise you love. That part of me died with Sarah. Florence Ida stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fields that would need tending come spring, if there was a spring to come. In the distance, she could see the glow of campfires on the horizon, growing brighter with each passing hour. But as she turned to give him her answer, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the evening silence, and both of them knew that whatever choice she made, it would have to be made now. The riders burst into the yard like thunder made flesh. 3 Union soldiers, their blue uniforms torn and muddy, their horses lathered with sweat and fear. The lead rider, barely more than a boy, swayed in his saddle as blood seeped through his fingers pressed against his side. Please, he gasped, his voice cracking with desperation. Confederates, 2 miles back. They're burning everything. Nathaniel moved without hesitation, catching the boy as he slumped forward. Florence Ida found herself beside him, her hands already reaching for the soldier's wound before her mind could question the wisdom of harboring Union men this close to Confederate territory. Get him inside, she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos thundering in her chest. The others, too. The second soldier, a grizzled sergeant with gray at his temples, shook his head. Can't stay, miss. They'll track us here. Then they'll find 3 dead men instead of 3 live ones, Florence Ida replied, already supporting the wounded boy's other side. Your choice. You can almost smell the desperation in the air, that metallic scent of blood mixing with the acrid smoke drifting from the south. As they carried the injured soldier into Nathaniel's kitchen, Florence Ida caught a glimpse of orange flames dancing on the horizon. The war had finally come to find them. The boy, Johnny, the sergeant called. Him, couldn't be more than 16. As Florence Ida cut away his shirt, she found herself thinking of her lost brothers, wondering if they'd died with strangers tending their wounds or if they'd breathed their last alone in some distant field. You've done this before, Nathaniel observed, watching her work with practiced efficiency. Papa taught me, she said, threading a needle with steady hands. Said a woman on a farm needs to know how to mend what's broken. The sergeant, Murphy, he'd introduced himself, kept watch at the window while his companion, a silent man with haunted eyes, slumped in the corner. They're coming fast, Murphy reported. Maybe 30 minutes. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. There's a root cellar behind the house. Hidden door under the back porch. We won't hide while you face them alone, Murphy said. You will if you want to see another sunrise. Florence Ida's voice brooked no argument as she tied off the last stitch. This is our land. Our rules. As the men reluctantly allowed Nathaniel to lead them to the cellar, Florence Ida moved through the house with purposeful calm. She cleared away the bloody rags, straightened the chairs, and placed a pot of coffee on the stove. When the Confederates arrived, they would find only a man and woman sharing an evening meal. What? Nathaniel asked as she ladled stew into 2 bowls. Why risk everything for strangers? She paused, her hand tightening on the ladle. Because someone has to choose mercy over survival. Because if we don't, what are we fighting to preserve? The sound of approaching horses grew louder. Nathaniel moved to the window, his face grim in the lamplight. 8 men, well-armed. Florence Ida smoothed her skirts and took her place at the table, her heart hammering against her ribs. She thought of her sisters, married off to men they barely knew, and wondered if they'd ever faced a moment where everything they were would be tested by fire. The pounding on the door came like judgment itself. Open up. Confederate Army. Nathaniel walked to the door with measured steps, his hand resting casually on the latch. When he opened it, the leader of the patrol, a captain with cold eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, stepped inside without invitation. Captain Thorne, the man introduced himself, his gaze sweeping the room. We're tracking Union deserters. 3 men on horseback, 1 wounded. Haven't seen any soldiers, Nathaniel replied evenly. Just been having supper with Miss Florence. The captain's eyes settled on her, and she felt the weight of his suspicion like a physical thing. Miss Florence what? Rhodes, she said, lifting her chin. From the township. Rhodes. Thorne's scarred face creased in thought. Your father's the one who's been selling off his daughters. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. My father's made his choices. I've made mine. And what choice is that? Before she could answer, Nathaniel stepped forward. She's agreed to marry me. The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged pistol. Florence Ida felt the world tilt on its axis, not from the declaration itself, but from the quiet certainty in his voice, as if he'd been carrying this truth for longer than the past hour. Captain Thorne's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Convenient. Timing, wouldn't you say? A proposal right when Union soldiers are running through the countryside. Love doesn't wait for convenient times, Florence Ida said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. As any soldier's wife could tell you. The captain circled the table like a predator sensing weakness. His men spread out behind him, their weapons casual but ready. You can almost hear the silence stretching thin, ready to snap. You wouldn't mind if we searched the premises? Thorne asked, though it wasn't really a question. Search all you like, Nathaniel said. But you'll find nothing but a man trying to court a woman before the whole world burns down around us. As the soldiers tramped through the house, Florence Ida forced herself to eat, each bite sawdust in her mouth. Nathaniel sat across from her, his presence steady as bedrock, and she found herself wondering when this stranger had become her anchor in a storm she hadn't seen coming. The search lasted an eternity measured in heartbeats. They found nothing. Of course, Nathaniel had built that root cellar himself, and he'd built it well. But as the soldiers prepared to leave, Captain Thorne paused at the door. Strange thing, he said, his voice deceptively casual. That coffee smells mighty fresh for folks who've been eating supper. Florence Ida's blood turned to ice water. She'd made the coffee to cover the smell of blood and antiseptic, but fresh coffee at evening time. It was the kind of detail that could hang them all. Made it for dessert, she said, praying her voice wouldn't betray her. Nathaniel has a sweet tooth. The captain's smile was cold as winter moonlight. Does he now? But as he turned to go, one of his men called out from the yard. Captain, fresh horse tracks heading east. They're not more than 20 minutes old. The Confederate patrol thundered east into the darkness, their torches bobbing like fallen stars against the night sky. Florence Ida didn't move from the kitchen table until the last hoofbeat faded into silence, her hands still wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. They're gone, Nathaniel said quietly, but his voice carried no relief. For now, she stood on unsteady legs, her body finally registering the terror she'd held at bay. Those tracks they found, mine, he admitted. From yesterday evening when I rode out to check the south pasture. Lucky thing I took that route. The weight of how close they'd come to discovery settled between them like a third presence in the room. Florence Ida moved to the window, watching the eastern horizon where the soldiers had vanished. In the distance, she could see the glow of flames. Another farm, another family's life reduced to ash and memory. We need to get them out of here, she said. Before daylight, they descended into the root cellar to find Murphy cleaning his rifle with grim efficiency while the silent soldier, Coleman, she'd learned, tended to young Johnny's fever. The boy's breathing was shallow, his face pale as moonlight. He needs a doctor. Coleman spoke for the first time, his voice rough with worry. Nearest doctor's in town, Nathaniel said. But that's 20 miles through Confederate territory. Florence Ida knelt beside the boy, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. In the lamplight, he looked even younger, someone's son, someone's. Hope carried off to war and returned broken. She thought of her own brothers, of all the mothers who would never see their boys come home. There's another way, she said slowly. The old Cherokee Trail through Devil's Hollow. It's treacherous, but it leads to the Union lines. Murphy shook his head. He can't ride in his condition. Then we take him in a wagon. Miss Florence. Nathaniel's voice was gentle but firm. That trail's been abandoned for 20 years. It's barely more than a deer path now, and in the dark. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination that made his breath catch. Then we make it work. Because the alternative is watching a boy die while we stand here debating impossibilities. You can almost taste the desperation. In the air, that metallic tang of fear mixed with the earthy smell of the root cellar. But beneath it all, something else was stirring, the kind of courage that blooms in the darkest moments, when ordinary people choose to become something more. I know that trail, Coleman said suddenly. Scouted it 6 months ago. There's a way through, but we'd need someone who knows the local landmarks. Florence Ida felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. I grew up exploring those woods. Papa used to take me hunting deer along that path before. She trailed off, remembering happier times when her family was whole. It's suicide, Murphy muttered, but his tone suggested he was already resigned to the attempt. Everything's suicide these days, she replied. The question is whether we die trying to save a life or die having done nothing at all. They spent the next hour preparing for what might be their final journey. Nathaniel hitched his strongest horse to the farm wagon while Florence Ida gathered supplies, blankets, water, what little food they could spare. The men loaded their weapons and checked their ammunition with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who'd learned to expect the worst. As they prepared to leave, Florence Ida found herself standing in Nathaniel's parlor, staring at the daguerreotype of his dead wife. The woman in the image seemed to be watching her with knowing eyes, as if she understood the weight of the choice being made. She was beautiful, Florence Ida said as Nathaniel appeared beside her. She was kind, he replied. Like you. The comparison should have felt awkward, but instead it settled between them like a bridge spanning the chasm of his grief. Florence Ida realized that she wasn't competing with a ghost. She was honoring a legacy of compassion that Sarah Barlow had left behind. What I said before, Nathaniel continued, his voice carefully neutral. About marriage. I didn't mean to presume. You didn't presume, she interrupted, turning to face him. You offered protection when I needed it. That's not presumption. That's decency. And after tonight, if we survive this. She looked into his eyes, seeing not just the man who'd lost his wife, but the man who'd opened his door to strangers and risked everything for the sake of mercy. Ask me again when we're not running. From Confederate patrols. His smile was small but genuine. I'll hold you to that. The wagon rolled out into the pre-dawn darkness, its wheels muffled by the frost-brittle grass. Johnny lay unconscious in the back, wrapped in blankets that smelled of lavender and hope. Murphy rode alongside while Coleman walked ahead, his keen eyes scanning for obstacles in the treacherous path. Florence Ida sat beside Nathaniel on the driver's bench, guiding him through turns that existed more in memory than reality. The Cherokee Trail wound through Devil's Hollow like a snake through sleeping stones, its path marked by lightning-struck trees and moss-covered boulders that had stood since before the first white settlers arrived. There, she whispered, pointing to a gap between two towering pines. The trail branches left at the Owl Rock. As they navigated the turn, a sound reached them from behind, distant but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Multiple riders, moving fast. They're tracking us, Murphy said, his voice tight with controlled fear. Nathaniel urged the horse forward, but the wagon could only move so fast on the narrow, root-tangled path. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, and Florence Ida realized with crystalline clarity that they weren't going to outrun there. Hunters. Stop, she said suddenly. What? Stop the wagon. She was already climbing down, her mind racing through possibilities. There's a cave system about 50 yards ahead. If we can get Johnny inside. And then what? Nathaniel demanded. They'll find us eventually. Florence Ida met his gaze, and in that moment, he saw something that made his heart clench with pride and terror. She'd made her choice, and it was the kind of choice that left no room for retreat. Then we make our stand, she said simply. All of us. Together. But as the first torch appeared through the trees behind them, Florence Ida realized that the pursuing riders wore blue uniforms, and their leader was calling out names that made her blood run cold. Florence. Florence Ida Rhodes. The voice that cut through the darkness made her heart stop beating. She knew that voice, had heard it call her name across summer fields and winter hearths for 19 years of her life. Samuel, she whispered, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. The lead rider emerged from the shadows, and Florence Ida felt the world tilt on its axis. Her brother, her dead brother, sat astride a Union horse, his face gaunt but alive, his eyes searching the darkness until they found her. "Dear God," Nathaniel breathed, his hand instinctively reaching for her arm as she swayed. Samuel Rhodes dismounted with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to live with pain. His left arm hung stiffly at his side, and a jagged scar ran from his temple to his jaw, but he was undeniably, impossibly alive. "Sister," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've been looking for you." Florence Ida moved toward him like a woman walking through a dream. The brother she'd mourned, whose death had helped drive their father to desperate measures, stood before her in Union blue. The brother for whom she'd worn black and wept bitter tears. "We thought you were dead," she said, her voice barely audible. "Papa got word from Gettysburg. I was supposed to be." Samuel's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Took shrapnel to the head. Lost my memory for near 6 months. When it came back, I found myself in a Union hospital, branded a deserter by my own side." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Samuel, Confederate-born and bred, had been forced to choose between death and donning enemy colors. The war had stolen more than just his memory. It had stolen his identity, his place in the world. "The boy's with me," Murphy said cautiously, gesturing toward the wagon where Johnny lay unconscious. "We were bringing them to safety." Samuel's eyes hardened as he took in the scene. The wounded soldier, the supplies, the desperate flight through enemy territory. "You're harboring Union soldiers. We're saving lives," Florence Ida said, her chin lifting with defiant pride. "Same as someone saved yours." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Behind Samuel, his patrol waited. 6 men who'd followed him into this maze of loyalty and betrayal. You can almost hear the weight of impossible choices settling over them all like fallen snow. "The Confederates came through earlier," Nathaniel said carefully. "They're hunting these men." "I know." Samuel's voice was flat. "Captain Thorne's patrol. They're good at what they do." Florence Ida studied her brother's face, seeing the man the war had carved from the boy she'd known. "You're not going to turn them in." It wasn't a question. Despite everything, the uniform, the circumstances, the danger, she knew the heart that beat beneath that blue coat. Samuel Rhodes might wear Union colors, but his soul remained his own. "I should," he said quietly. "Duty demands it." "Duty to who?" she challenged. "To an army that calls you deserter? To a cause that made you choose between death and dishonor?" Samuel's scarred face twisted with pain. "To the men who'll die if I don't." "And what about the man who'll die if you do?" She gestured toward the wagon where Johnny's fever-weakened breathing was the only sound in the terrible silence. The standoff stretched like a wire-pulled taut. Samuel's men shifted restlessly, their loyalty to their sergeant warring with their understanding of the larger conflict. These were soldiers who'd seen too much death, who'd learned that survival sometimes meant making choices that would haunt them forever. "There's another way," Nathaniel said suddenly. "The cave system Florence mentioned. It leads to a series of natural tunnels that come out near the Union lines. You'd help us?" Samuel asked, surprised. "I'd help my future wife save her brothers." "Soul." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Florence Ida felt something shift inside her chest. Not just gratitude, but recognition. This man who'd offered his name for her protection was now offering his freedom for her family's salvation. "Future wife." Samuel's eyebrows rose. "If she'll have me," Nathaniel said simply. "After tonight." Florence Ida looked between the 2 men, her brother, torn between duty and conscience, and the widower who'd become her anchor in a world gone mad. The choice that had seemed impossible hours ago now felt inevitable. "Samuel," she said softly, "you can't save everyone. But you can save these 3. Her brother closed his eyes, and when he opened them, she saw the boy she'd once known, the one who'd taught her to catch fireflies and told her stories under summer stars. "The tunnel entrance," he said finally. "Where?" The next hour blurred. Together in a desperate dance of survival, they carried Johnny deeper into the cave system, following passages that ancient water had carved from living rock. Florence Ida led the way, her memory of childhood explorations guiding them through chambers that echoed with the sound of their breathing. Behind them, the distant sound of Confederate pursuit grew louder. Captain Thorne had found their trail, and he was closing in with the patience of a predator who knew his prey was trapped. "How much further?" Murphy asked, his voice tight with exhaustion. "Not far," Florence Ida replied, though her own strength was failing. The tunnel ahead branched into 3 passages, and she struggled to remember which one led to freedom. That's when they heard it, the sound of water. Not the drip of condensation, but the musical babble of a stream flowing toward daylight. "This way," she said, her heart lifting with hope. But as they emerged from the cave system into the gray light of dawn, they found themselves facing not salvation, but a line of Confederate rifles. Captain Thorne stood at their center, his scarred face twisted with triumphant cruelty. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who'd cornered his prey. "Miss Florence Rhodes, and her Union-loving friends." Florence. Ida stepped forward, placing herself between the Confederate captain and the wounded boy they'd carried so far. Behind her, she could hear Nathaniel's steady breathing, feel Samuel's presence at her shoulder. "You want them," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her heart. "You'll have to go through me." But as Captain Thorne raised his hand to signal his men, the morning air erupted with a sound that froze every heart, the distinctive whistle of incoming artillery, and it was falling fast. The world exploded into thunder and flame. The artillery shell struck the ridge above them, sending a cascade of stone and earth tumbling toward the Confederate line. Captain Thorne's men, scattered like startled birds, their formation shattered by the chaos of sudden bombardment. Through the smoke and dust, Florence Ida saw her chance. "The stream," she shouted, grabbing one end of Johnny's stretcher. "Follow the water." They plunged into the shallow creek, the icy water shocking their systems into desperate clarity. Behind them, more shells whistled overhead. Not random fire, but the precise targeting of artillery observers who'd been watching the Confederate movements. "Union advance," Samuel called out, his voice cutting through the din. "They're pushing through Devil's Hollow." The irony wasn't lost on Florence Ida. The same treacherous path that had nearly killed them was now bringing salvation in the form of blue-coated soldiers who emerged from the forest like avenging angels. They splashed downstream for what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, their feet numb with cold, their breath misting in the morning air. Johnny stirred on his stretcher, his fever-bright eyes focusing on Florence Ida's face. "Ma'am," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of rushing water. "Where are we?" "Almost home," she told him, though she wasn't sure where home was anymore. The farm where she'd grown up felt like a memory from another life. The future she'd imagined for herself had been rewritten by war and circumstance. The stream widened into a small pond, and beyond it, she could see the blue uniforms of Union soldiers establishing a field hospital. Medical tents were already rising like white flowers against the brown earth, and the blessed sound of organization, orders being given, supplies being distributed, reached them like a hymn of hope. "Medic," Murphy called out as they reached the Union lines. "Wounded man here." The next hour blurred together in a symphony of relief and exhaustion. Johnny was whisked away to proper medical care, his chances suddenly bright in the hands of skilled doctors. Murphy and Coleman were debriefed by their commanding officers, their long journey through enemy territory finally at an end. Florence Ida found herself sitting on a supply crate, watching the controlled chaos of an army in motion. Beside her, Nathaniel remained silent, his presence steady as bedrock even as the world shifted around them. "Your brother's a good man," he said finally. She looked across the camp to where Samuel stood with his patrol, making his report to a Union colonel. Even in enemy uniform, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who'd chosen honor over easy survival. "He always was," she replied. "The war just made it harder to see." "A lot of things are harder to see in wartime," Nathaniel said quietly, "including what matters most." She turned to study his profile, seeing the man who'd opened his door to strangers and risked everything for the sake of mercy. "And what matters most to you?" "You," he said simply, "if you'll have me." The proposal, real this time, not born of desperation but of understanding, settled between them like a gift. Florence Ida thought of her sisters, married off to men they barely knew, and realized she was being offered something different. Not a transaction, but a choice. Not security, but partnership. "I'll have you," she said, her voice steady with certainty. "But I need to go home first." To say goodbye. They found Franklin Rhodes in his chair by the window, his breathing shallow, but peaceful. Mabel and sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her own battle with consumption evident in the hollows of her cheeks. "Florence," her father whispered as she knelt beside him. "You came back. I brought someone to meet you," she said, gesturing for Nathaniel to step forward. "Papa, this is Nathaniel Barlow. He's asked for my hand." Franklin's eyes, still sharp despite his failing body, studied the younger man with the intensity of a father protecting his last remaining daughter. "You love her." "I'm learning to," Nathaniel answered honestly. "She's teaching me how." The old man's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "That's the right answer, son. Love ain't something you find. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice." Mabel reached for Florence Ida's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Your sisters," she said softly. "They're safe. Happy even. But you were. Always the one who stayed. The one who chose love over safety." "I learned it from you," Florence Ida replied, kissing her mother's forehead. They were married 3 days later in the little church where Florence Ida had been baptized, with Samuel giving her away and the whole town in attendance. The war still raged beyond their borders, but for one afternoon, peace reigned in the hearts of people who'd learned that love could bloom even in the darkest soil. Franklin Rhodes lived long enough to see his daughter wed, passing quietly in his sleep too. Weeks later with a smile on his face, Mabel followed him before the first snow, her final words a blessing for the couple who'd chosen each other against all odds. The farm that had once struggled to feed 8 now flourished under the care of 2 people who understood that some things were worth tending. Florence Ida planted roses along the fence line, Sarah's roses, from seeds Nathaniel had saved, and watched them bloom in the spring sunshine. Johnny recovered fully and returned to his family in Ohio, but not before pressing a small wooden carving into Florence Ida's hands, a figure of a woman standing with her arms outstretched, protecting something precious. "For the angel who saved my life," he said simply. Samuel chose to remain with his Union regiment, finding purpose in helping other displaced soldiers navigate the complicated landscape of divided loyalties. He visited when he could, bringing news from the wider world and stories of men who'd found ways to honor both duty and conscience. You can almost smell the roses blooming now, their perfume carried on the evening breeze as Florence Ida tends her garden. The war will end eventually, she knows, but the choices they made in its shadow will echo through generations. As she watches Nathaniel repair the fence that marks their boundary, she realizes that some walls are meant to protect, not divide. Some names are given not as chains, but as gifts. And some daughters stay not because they have no choice, but because they choose to build something beautiful from the ruins of what was. The sound of his laughter mingles with the evening song of birds returning to roost, and Florence Ida Barlow, no longer Rhodes, but not diminished by the change, knows that some bartered goods become treasures in the right hands. If you found yourself moved by Florence Ida's courage and Nathaniel's quiet strength, like this story and share it with someone who believes in love that blooms against all odds. And let us know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today?